So we have one more speaker, of course, today. He is a husband, father, grandfather, pastor, writer, podcaster, professor. Ran out of room on the index card. So he's written for numerous magazines, including Touchstone, Modern Reformation, The Imaginative Conservative, and First Things. He's written books including In the House of Tom Bombadil and The Household and the War for the Cosmos. He's also a co-host of the Theology Podcast. So let's welcome C.R. Wiley at this time.
Thank you. It's great to be here with you, and I've been looking forward to coming. West Virginia is a place I've been a number of times, but it's always been up north in the Morgantown area. And I also have a place in my heart for West Virginia because it's a really significant location with regard to my ancestry. There are actually towns and locales in West Virginia up in the north that are named Wiley. There's Wiley Ford, Wileyville. That's an interesting one. Anyway, they're all up in that this general area, and those are my ancestors. My ancestors go back about 250, 300 years in this part of the country. There's actually a park in Kentucky named for my sixth great-grandmother, Jenny Wiley State Park, and I intend to go over there tomorrow. I've never been there, but if it wasn't for her, I wouldn't be here. So anyway, glad to check it out. I don't know if you're familiar with the story of Jenny Wiley, but she was her homestead. Her husband Thomas was away, actually at market selling ginseng that he collected in the forest, and while he was away, there was an Indian raid on the homestead, and she was captured and all of her children were killed. And she escaped after 11-month captivity and was reunited to her husband, and she had another batch of kids. I mean, they just don't make gals like that anymore. Another batch. So I'm obviously a descendant from the second batch. But anyway, I want to talk about something along the lines of what we've been discussing here in this conference. My talk is dedicated or addressing the subject of re-enchanting the cosmos. Whereas my friends from the UK, people like Michael Ward, cosmos, I always feel so pretentious when I say it that way. So I'll just stick with the American pronunciation, which is the right one anyway. We drive on the correct side of the road, which is the right side. We do everything over here. That's why our ancestors left that place. Silly problems with that part of the world. But anyway, I want to think with you a little bit about that. Really enjoyed Scott and Josh's talks, and fortunately you're going to hear some of the same things again, but repetition is good for you. Like, that's when something's important, you repeat it, and you repeat it, and repeat it. So you hear some things that you've heard before. So I want to begin with reflecting a little bit on the nature of my own work in this with regard to the theme of the imagination. I'm a writer. I've written not just nonfiction but fiction, and I had this crazy idea that since George MacDonald could do it, he was a pastor and a writer, I could do it too. And it was only later that I discovered that actually he quit being a pastor so he could be a writer. In other words, it didn't go together quite as easily as I had assumed to be the case. But if he could do it, he could crank out all those books, I could do it too. They really are. It's really difficult to make time to write fiction, particularly when maybe the kind of fiction that you are writing isn't necessarily the kind of thing that maybe Scott was talking about, sort of standard Christian fiction with maybe girls with, who look like Amish girls, on the covers of the books and that kind of stuff. That would be okay to write that kind of stuff, but the kind of stuff that I tend to write, it's a little more difficult for people to relate to. They're wondering when the altar call is going to happen. Anyway, so I've given a lot of thought to the subject of, the creative enterprise, and particularly to the matter that we're discussing, which is enchantment. I'd like to reflect a little bit with you on a couple of words in the title of my talk. One is cosmos, or cosmos, and the other is enchantment. So let me begin with enchantment. I came across something, just picked up this edition of Lewis fairy stories, or not Lewis, Tolkien fairy stories. And when you know it, they have a definition of enchantment in here. Stumbled on it. And I'll read it to you, it's not terribly long. Enchantment, to enchant. Now, there you go. That might know what it means. The word is derived from the Middle English enchanted, from Old French enchanteur, from Latin incantare, to enchant with magic words, and incantation, as in to cast under a spell, to bewitch. Thus, enchantment is the act of enchanting, as well as the state or condition of being enchanted, bewitched, or enspelled. Enspelled. That's interesting. We'll get into that in a minute. It is important to note that this particular altered state is dependent upon words spoken or sung. Words spoken or sung. That's significant. Well, let's think about cosmos, and what we're referring to when we use that word. When we think about it, well, let's just step back and put it in a little different frame of reference. What in the world is the cosmos? What in the world is the cosmos? You know, when I think about the word, you know, another phrase, kind of humorous phrase, comes to mind. It's all Greek to me, meaning it's difficult to understand. But it just so happens that the word cosmos is Greek. It comes to us from the Greek cosmos. And we find it in the Bible quite a bit. Unfortunately, you wouldn't know because it's usually translated with the English word world. Now, this is a problem because when we think world, we think of place. In other words, like the planet we live on, the Earth. Or we think about the world in terms of sort of the social environment that we find ourselves in, the world as it is, in other words, that sort of thing. But that misses a lot. Something's lost in translation, in other words. Something's lost in translation. So, to give you a sense of what was lost, I'd like to take you to Ephesians. Now, in the letter to the Ephesians, we have the word cosmos used a lot, and it's almost always translated as world, except when it's adjectival in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 12, which is an interesting thing for them to do. In other words, they're inconsistent in their approach to translating the word. Let me read to you that verse, you'll get a sense of what I'm getting at. So it reads, "For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers," cosmic, adjectival, powers over this present darkness, against the supernatural forces of evil in the heavenly places. Now they could have just used the term worldly, right? It's the adjectival use of the word world. But in this particular case, that might not have conveyed what they wanted to convey with the translation. I wish they had just used cosmos all the way through. In other words, wherever you see the word world, use the word cosmos. That would be helpful for a number of reasons. But the word itself is not necessarily a reference to a place or a planet. It means an order. So something is a cosmos when you're thinking of it in terms of an order. And the cosmos in Scripture is the largest order of them all. So you have the large order, and within that large order, we find ourselves making smaller orders, microcosms. So there's always been an understanding of a relationship between the macrocosm and the microcosm, and how those two things relate to each other, or should reflect each other. Now, I think for most of us, we were introduced to the word cosmos through its use in scientific circles, maybe pop science, particularly Carl Sagan. Remember Carl Sagan? Those of you who are old enough to remember Carl Sagan may remember that he had a PBS television show called Cosmos. And that was really sort of his launching pad to kind of celebrity atheist status that he acquired but he was a physicist. He's no longer with us. There's been a sort of an updated version of Cosmos that was Neil deGrasse Tyson. Is that his name? How his name is pronounced? He redid it. Anyway, with the original series, there was this famous introduction that went as follows. So this is saying, the cosmos is all that is or was or ever will be. Our feeblest contemplations of the cosmos stir us. There is a tingling in the spine, a catch in the voice, a faint sensation as if a distant memory of falling from height. We know we are approaching the greatest of mysteries. Now, what he was referring to is not cosmos as it was understood in antiquity, but the contemporary way of thinking about the cosmos that was, I think, well developed and elaborated upon for us by Josh. Sort of this contemporary understanding of a mechanism, a vast mechanism that we find ourselves in. But there is the older way of thinking about it, and we find ourselves stumbling over this older way of thinking about things when we read books like The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. And in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, we have a youthful version of Carl Sagan named Eustace Clarence Scrubb. It's one of the great names in all English literature. And in that book, he and the crew of the Dawn Treader find themselves visiting an island, and on that island, they actually meet a star. I'm in Duke, I think that's how his name is pronounced. And in response to this discovery that he's addressing a star, Eustace, by the way, Eustace has an assonance, kind of like useless. Anyway, but he says, in our world, a star is a huge ball of flaming gas. That's my best Eustace impersonation. To this, the star replies, even in your world, my son, that is not what a star is, but only what it is made of. So this distinction between what something is and what something is made of, made there, and that reflects this older, deeper, wiser understanding of how things work in this large order. I think Lewis really had in mind the whole project with his entire corpus, literary corpus when it comes to his fiction, of re-enchanting the cosmos. I think, and that's why basically I'm going to be talking mostly about Lewis, because I really think that was what his project was dedicated to. And we see different things, not only in the Chronicles of Narnia, but also in the Ransom trilogy. By the way, never call it the Space Trilogy. Amen. At least not in the presence of Michael Ford. Because if you do, you're in trouble. Anyway, in Out of the Center of the Planet, the main character, Ransom, who was, by the way, inspired by Tolkien. In other words, this is supposedly a story in which Tolkien has been captured and taken to another planet. But his name in the story, of course, is Ransom. And as he was abducted by a guy named Weston, who was a physicist, and another fellow by the name of Divine. And as they travel to Mars, there's an alteration in Ransom's outlook, and this particular portion of the story elaborates why that has occurred. So let me quote from Out of the Center of the Planet. As time wore on, Ransom became aware of a spiritual cause for his progressive lightening and exaltation of heart, or lightening and exaltation of heart. A nightmare long engendered in the modern mind by the mythology that follows in the wake of science, I should say. Let me read that again, because that's a very pregnant and important sentence. A nightmare long engendered in the modern mind by the mythology that follows in the wake of silence, or I keep saying silence, science, was falling off him. He had read of space At the back of his thinking for years had lurked the dismal fancy of the black, cold vacuity, the utter deadness, which was supposed to separate the worlds. He had not known how much it had affected him until now. Now that very name, space, seemed blasphemous libel for this empyrean ocean of radiance in which they swam. No, space was the wrong name. Older thinkers had been wiser when they named it simply the heavens. So this is the distinction that Lewis draws between space as it's understood and reflected upon by materialists like Carl Sagan and this older way of thinking that saw something much richer that surrounds us. Are you familiar with the book, The Discarded Image? If you're not, you should pick it up. It's not necessarily an easy read. It was his latest, I believe it was Lewis's last work published. It was his lectures that he delivered, I think, both at Oxford and at Cambridge, but it's actually published by Cambridge University Press. But in that book, he outlines the older way of thinking about the cosmos. It's the Ptolemaic model. Perhaps you're familiar with the transition between the heliocentric and the geocentric ways of thinking about things. But even apart from those two models, there's this reality that was experienced by people who looked up into the heavens in antiquity and saw moving objects, and those moving objects were envisioned to be the planets. Of course, you have the 7 planets. Now, you and I know that, well, depending on what your thoughts on Pluto are, they're either 9 or 8, but the planets, as they understood them, were the planets that could be seen with the naked eye on a clear night. And they included Mercury, Venus, the Moon, the Sun, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. And what they envisioned was that we were at the center of a series of concentric circles, crystalline in character, upon which the planets moved. And there was a kind of music that was generated as the planets moved. The music of the spheres, which you may have run across that phrase in a hymn and wondered what it was referring to. It was referring to that. And each of these planets, in some sense, had an influence on our world, a governing influence on it, almost in a kind of, astrological way, and often understood as influencing the sort of the character of the times that we find ourselves in, or even our own, what we would call today, moods. So, for example, and you can see this in just the way certain words that we still use today. So, jovial should bring something to mind, should bring lightheartedness, mirth, and so forth. The word jovial is derived from the word Jove, which is another way of saying Jupiter. So the effect, the influence of Jupiter is jovial in character. Feasting and festivity and so forth are associated with Jove. Saturnine is the word that we don't use very often, but every once in a while you do hear someone use that word, and it means gloomy. And when it came to how these different ways or these different planets and how they influence, or were believed to influence our world, how those planets inspired Lewis, each of those planets, according to the book Planet Narnia and the author Michael Ward, actually influenced and inspired each of the books in the series, Chronicles of Narnia. I don't know if you're familiar with the thesis, but I think it's pretty well established that that's what Lewis is up to. It's remarkable that Lewis pulled this off and kept Tolkien in the dark. Have you ever thought about that? If you're familiar with the relationship between Tolkien and Lewis, you know that they were friends, but Tolkien was dismissive of Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia because he thought they were hastily written, kind of sloppy, mixed up mythologies and so forth. But there's no evidence in at least that I'm aware of, that Lewis let him in on the secret, what he was up to. Maybe it was because he knew Tolkien wouldn't approve. I don't know. But there's nothing out there in any of the letters that Lewis wrote or any of the things that we have in terms of the conversations, the recorded conversations between Tolkien and Lewis that would give us an indication that he ever let him in on the secret. But I think it's pretty well established that that was the case. That's what was going on with the different stories. So when you think about the different stories, obviously language in the wardrobe, if you're familiar with the thesis, is associated with Jupiter. I'll get into more of the kind of the detail on that in a minute. But when you think about the other books, what book would you associate with, say, Saturn? Just your own thoughts. I already mentioned that there's sort of a gloomy character to the Saturnine influence. What's that? Puddleglum, that's right. So it would be what? Well, actually, that was the silver chair. So silver chair would be the moon.
Yeah.
Last
Battle would be Saturn, right? And you go through and you can say, you can kind of you think about the different stories. You know, you can have kind of a sort of a kind of an emotional response to them. So my favorite stories are Voyage of the Dawn Treader, which is kind of gives itself away as the sun, right? The dawn, right? And then Magician's Nephew, which is Venus. It's interesting that those are the two stories that appeal to me most sort of, I think, viscerally. But the others, Caspian, Mars, Horse's Void, Mercury, what other ones were missing? I already mentioned Silver Chair, which would be Moon.
Did you say Magician's Nephew? Magician's Nephew?
Magician's Nephew would be Venus.
Oh, okay.
So I think I covered them all. Yeah. So now, with regard to this, you can also interpret the Ransom trilogy in the same, in this similar light. With the Ransom trilogy, he takes the cosmology as we currently understand it working, and it seeks to harmonize the older understanding of the cosmos with contemporary science. So the silent planet is our planet. It's the Earth out of the silent planet. Why is it the silent planet? Because it's cut off communications to the rest of the cosmos. It's set itself apart. It's in rebellion. So those of us who are, unfortunate enough to live on this planet are not on good terms with the rest of the cosmos for that reason. Now, when we think about the other stories, we think about, say, for example, Paralandra, which is Venus, or Malacandra, which is Mars in the Ransom trilogy. You have creatures on these other planets, but they're unfallen. And then you've got this character Ransom who encounters them and interacts with them. And what Lewis is getting at with this is an idea that I know is sometimes not well received in certain circles. The idea that we live in a cosmos with many other sentient beings. Now, in the discarded image, the principle of plenitude is something that Lewis reflects on a bit. Principle of plenitude is the assumption that, or the conviction that, wherever something, wherever there is a place that can be inhabited, it is. And when it comes to creation, we can think about various spheres within the creative order, just strictly sticking to Scripture that would give us some sense that this is the case. So, for example, when we're told that in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, that there are different bodies, spiritual bodies and physical bodies, that can be inhabited by spirits, it goes as follows. Not all flesh is the same, but there's one kind for humans, another for animals, and another for fish. There are heavenly bodies and earthly bodies. But the glory of the heavenly is of one kind, and the glory of the earthly is another. Now let's apply this refers to the angelic host. So when we think about bodies, are angelic creatures embodied, or are they spirits that are disembodied? Something to think about. If we were to think about spirits as being disembodied, that would mean that we can't locate them in space and time. They're, in some sense, outside of space and time, and so consequently difficult to sort of identify and relate to. But something that is embodied is, in some sense, subject to being located, identified, and consequently, it's possible to interact with that creature that is embodied in that way. So when we think about earthly bodies and heavenly bodies, when we think about spiritual bodies, we could say that the medieval understanding, which is what Lewis was describing with regard to the discarded image, and by the way, the term discarded image means that what he was referring to is that there was a model of the cosmos that people had that they used to understand sort of the workings of the world around them, and it's no longer used, it's been discarded. We have something else that we use now to help us think about things. But what was lost in the process of the discarding of the old image is this sense that we find ourselves in this rich, inhabited, created order that has various levels, and there are creatures that inhabit each of those levels. Some of those creatures we can see, like the fish of the sea, and the birds of the air, or the animals that we see upon the surface of the earth, or even ourselves. And then creatures that we cannot perceive with the eyes, that we cannot hear with our ears, that are nevertheless real and inhabit these ethereal regions, these heavenly regions, these regions that are just as real as the world that we live in, and that we can see with our eyes and hear with our ears, and is created by God, but is not something that we can characterize as physical. So this is the kind of the larger picture of the cosmos that Lewis elaborates on and tries to help us to perceive and appreciate through his fiction, but also through his scholarship. By the way, when it comes to his scholarship, that's what the discarded image is an example of. Now, we find ourselves in a situation today where we've lost the ability to see and appreciate the unseen. And consequently, it doesn't have the value in our scale of values that it once did. And the reason is we're suffering from a kind of enchantment. This is something that Josh was referring to earlier. And I'm actually going to quote the same passage from the Weight of Glory that Josh quoted earlier, but within this context, I'm hoping to pull some other things out of it. So this is from Weight of Glory. Do you think that I'm trying to weave a spell? Perhaps I am. But remember your fairy tales. Spells are used for breaking enchantments as well as inducing them. And you and I have need of the strongest spell that can be found to wake us from the evil enchantment of worldliness, which has been laid upon us for nearly 100 years. Well, getting closer to 150 years now or more. And what is that spell? Lewis had a clever way of describing it. He called it nothing buttery. Nothing buttery. And what he was getting at with that term, nothing buttery, is any time that you have the sense that you are apprehending something spiritual and real, that it's nothing but something else. So that's the term nothing buttery is referring to. And we have a marvelous representation or elaboration on how this works in the silver chair. Remember the Green Witch, the queen of the Underland, right? Well, there's a particular scene in which the Green Witch is trying to dissuade Eustace and Jill and Puddleglum of the reality of the upper world. She wants them to essentially embrace the idea that the underworld, the world that she controls and rules, is the only thing that there is. So this is what occurs in the story. Now the witch moved gently across the room. When she had come to a little ark, she opened it and took out a handful of green powder. This she threw on the fire. It did not blaze much, but a very sweet and drowsy smell came from it. And all through the conversation that followed, that smell grew stronger, and it made it hard to think. Jill couldn't remember the names of things in our world, and it didn't come into her head that she was being enchanted, for now the magic was in its full strength. And of course, the more enchanted you get, the more you feel that you are not enchanted at all. She found herself saying, and at the moment it was a relief to say, I suppose that other world must all be a dream. Yes, it is all a dream, said the witch. Yes, all a dream, said Jill. There never was such a world, said the witch. No, said Jill and Scrub, never was such a world. There never was any world but mine, said the witch. There never was any other world but yours, they said. In other words, nothing but a dream. So any time that you say the person who has been enchanted by this way of thinking to start enchantment, I think this has occurred. The response by that person will be, oh, that's nothing but this. I think, well, let's take an example derived from the world of psychology. Sigmund Freud, when he talked about the conviction that some people had that we have a heavenly Father, a creator, his explanation was, that's nothing but a projection of childish longings for someone who can provide the kind of security we all long for. Right? It's nothing but a psychological state. So this is the situation that we find ourselves in. We find ourselves in a world where we think we're awake, but we're actually asleep. We're surrounded by realities that we can't see with our eyes, and we've been told don't exist at all, but are actually things that are just projections of or evidence for something else that we can see with our eyes and know that's just material in character. So now, because we find ourselves in this sleep, we find ourselves really kind of in a dark fairy story like Sleeping Beauty or Rip Van Winkle. We are enchanted with this dark enchantment, which has caused us to lose our ability to apprehend and even remember this unseen realm. So this is the situation we find ourselves in. So what was Lewis's approach to addressing this problem? How did he approach the task of re-enchanting the world for us? What was his technique? Well, it was to tell stories, cast a kind of spell through storytelling. The spell that I think gets things going in the Course Chronicles of Narnia is The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And it's really a story about the re-enchanting of Narnia. So what we find in that story is that the world is in a state of winter, where it's always winter, but never Christmas. That annoyed Tolkien to no end, that he would insert Christmas into a story that's set in another world. And in a certain way, it makes for a problem. I mean, you've got this reality in our world, Christmas, being inserted into a parallel universe in which the term Christmas would apparently mean too much, but that, I think, misses a larger point that Lewis was making with regard to using the word Christmas. So always winter, but never Christmas. In other words, frozen, dead, and lifeless under the spell of a white witch. Nevertheless, we have Father Christmas who's introduced into the story. He appears at a very important point in the story. Now, when we think about Christmas, of course, what do we celebrate? We're celebrating the advent of Christ, the coming of our Savior. That's what we celebrate at Christmas time. But in the story, something follows the advent of Father Christmas, the coming of Father Christmas, and that, of course, is Aslan's arrival. I'll get to that more in a minute. But in our world, it's also a re-enchanting of the world we find ourselves in, or I should say, maybe the dispelling of a dark enchantment that we find ourselves subject to through the advent of Christ, his coming into the world. Now, back to that quotation that I read to you from the Weight of Glory. Lewis refers to the need for the strongest of spells in order to awaken us from the dark enchantment that we find ourselves subject to. One of the things that's really helpful when we think about the nature of the spell is what I noted earlier with regard to enchantment, something that's spoken, something that is something that follows the use of words. Tolkien on fairy stories has something remarkable to say about this. Have you ever thought about the fact that when we think about an enchantment, we think about casting a spell? What else do we mean when we use the word spell? We think about what? Spelling, right? You ever watch a spelling bee? Where people are trying to get the spelling correct, and they're given words in a spelling bee, which is a contest. There's a real connection here. In other words, it's not a coincidence that the word spell refers to both. Getting the words right, how they are constructed, and the use of those words. So spelling and language go together, and Tolkien on fairy stories alludes to this in sort of an offhanded way when he says that spelling, casting a spell, is a story told as well as a formula of power. And as you noted, Josh, gospel, God's spell. Remember the musical Godspell?
Yes.
I remember when I first saw that, I thought, oh, they're just playing with words. They're just bringing some things together that don't belong together. But actually, when I got an education, I thought, no, they're actually saying something that's sound. There is a spell that is cast by the gospel. It's a spell, and it's a formula of power. So I'm not ashamed of the gospel because it is the power of God. Right? So this is something that, so when you are proclaiming the gospel, you are casting a kind of spell. It's a spell that awakens, that revivifies, that brings back to life what is dead, what has died. And I think this is the point at which I should address the subject of the publication of the Chronicles of Narnia and the order in which they're published. So there are heretics who believe that the first book ought to be The Magician's Nephew. Right? I hope there are no heretics among us today. I think that the reason why Lewis begins where he begins is because he's addressing our situation as we find ourselves in our world. We find ourselves subject to a spell, an enchantment, and consequently we need something to wake us up. And what we see in the Chronicles of Narnia, that first book, The Land Which the War Purpose, we find ourselves in a deadened world, a world in which life seems to have basically left the world we find ourselves in, and we find ourselves in this frozen and dead terrain. And we need what we see happen in Chronicles of Narnia and happen in our world as well. This brings me to, of course, what follows the appearance of Father Christmas, and that is the arrival of Aslan himself. Mr. Beaver, if you might recall, when the dependencies are in the home of the Beavers, says at one point, they say Aslan is on the move. Perhaps has already landed. Isn't that an interesting way to put it? Has already landed. And now a very curious thing happened. None of the children knew who Aslan was any more than you do. But the moment the beaver had spoken these words, everyone felt quite different. Perhaps it was something, perhaps it has something, has sometimes, I'm going to say this again, I'm having a hard time reading today. Perhaps it has sometimes happened to you in a dream, that someone says something which you don't understand, but in the dream it feels as if it has some enormous meaning. Either a terrifying one which turns the whole dream into a nightmare, or else a lovely meaning, too lovely to put into words, which makes the dream so beautiful that you remember it all your life and are always wishing you could get into that dream again. It was like that now. At the name of Aslan, each one of the children felt something jump inside. Edmund felt a sensation of mysterious horror. Now we know why, of course. Peter felt suddenly brave and adventurous. Susan felt as if some delicious smell or some delightful strain of music had just floated by her. And Lucy got the feeling you have when you wake up in the morning and you realize that it is the beginning of the holidays or the beginning of summer. So, just at the very name Aslan, there is this, hearing the name Aslan, there's this transformation that occurs in each of the children, even though they don't understand who is being referred to at this point. When Aslan arrives, of course, what occurs in the story? The world thaws, comes back to life. It's not just simply a lion arriving and playing in the snow with the peasant seeds. What we see is that everything that is around the lion is transformed. And then things begin to wake up. It's as if they've been in hibernation. And this implies that the things that were dead and seemingly lifeless were not entirely so, but had been there all along. Kind of like we find ourselves in our world. Even though we find ourselves in a world which has lost a sense of its meaning and significance and enchantment, it's not as though the world that we live in is thoroughly disenchanted. What's wrong is our ability to apprehend the life that's around us that we can't see. And then there's that marvelous scene where Aslan goes to the witch's castle, and all of the creatures which dared to defy her, which had been turned to stone, are brought back to life with the breath of Aslan. There's something significant going on with that, of course, when we think about coming to life in Scripture. We think about the creation of Adam. What do we have? We have a man formed from the soil, and the breath of life is spoken into him when the Lord says, live. He comes to life. By the way, are you familiar with the Hebrew Adama, which is the basis for the Greek part for the word Adam? Just means soil. So literally, Adam is the earth man. Anyway, just a little aside there, a little extra, insight for you. But anyway, so how is the dark enchantment broken? We see in this particular episode, there's something that the tendencies are able to perceive but not fully appreciate. There's something that stirs inside him at the name Aslan. And what's being referred to there, I think, is something that constitutes the strongest argument Lewis makes. I keep wanting to say Tolkien, because I usually talk about him more than Lewis. But it has to do with something that he refers to in his autobiography, Surprised by Joy. Now, I remember when I read Surprised by Joy, or heard the title, I had a very different idea of what the book was about. Because when I think of the word joy, I think of something that's just kind of, exuberant character. Something that maybe you associate with a festive gathering or some kind of party, or maybe just having a really, really good day. But that's not what Lewis was referring to at all. He was referring to something that he had a German word for, and when it came to English words, he had to settle on the word joy. Now, I'm going to use the word here. It's one of these German words that looks like it should be pronounced a certain way in English, but actually is pronounced correctly. By the way, the Germans and the French do this to us English speakers all the time. They spell things a certain way, and then you discover that it's all a plot to make English people, speaking people, look silly. But anyway, the word is Sehnsucht. 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 This, by the way, is taken from the afterword of the third edition of Pilgrim's Progress, when he talks about it in some depth in Surprised by Joy. Sehnsucht is the longing for that unnameable something, the desire for which pierces us like a rapier at the smell of a bonfire, the sound of wild ducks flying overhead, the title of The Well at the World's End, the opening lines of Kubla Khan, the morning cobwebs in late summer, or the noise of falling waves. Now this is one of those things that if you've had this experience, you know what he's talking about. But if you haven't, you have no clue. I hope you have. I can remember different episodes of my life, or different points in my life, where there would be this, well, this just sense there's something more. And I had a deep longing for that more. But I couldn't put it into words. I couldn't identify or pin it down. But there was just this sense that this was the case, that there's something more. And in other places, Lewis describes this longing for the something more as the sweetest thing that you can know in this life. But what is that more that's being referred to? What is it that you're longing for? I think this is something that Lewis gets into again in The Weight of Glory. Read to you in the passage. And this, I think, helps us to appreciate what it means. So this is, again, as I noted, from The Weight of Glory. And he's referring to, at this point in the essay or the sermon, this longing that has been referred to as anchored. Do what they will then, is referring to the disenchanters or the dark enchantment. We remain conscious of a desire which no natural happiness will satisfy. But is there any reason to suppose that reality offers any satisfaction to it? Quote, nor does being hungry prove that we have bread, end of quote. But I think it may be urged that this misses the point. A man's physical hunger does not prove that a man will get any bread. He may die of starvation on a raft in the Atlantic, but surely a man's hunger does prove that he comes of a race which repairs its body by eating and inhabits a world where eatable substances exist. In the same way, though I do not believe, I wish I did, that my desire for paradise proves that I shall enjoy it, I think it is a pretty good indication that such a thing exists and that some men will. A man may love a woman and not win her, but it would be very odd if the phenomenon called falling in love occurred in a world where that sort of thing just can't happen. So the proof that there is something out there that can satisfy us in this particular way is the fact that this is what we long for. That's the nature of the argument. Now, the longing itself then is the sign, the fact that we have this desire. Now, what can prompt us to believe that such a thing actually does exist? Both the longing itself, but also pain, the sense that something distressing has occurred in our life can awaken us to something that gives us a sense that we were made for something more. Getting back to the story of the silver chair, in that story, as the witch continues to engage in her nothing buttery speech, Puddleglum, the marsh wiggle, who has a kind of a dour personality, very much in keeping with the saturnine gloominess that we were talking about earlier. He has the wherewithal to get up and actually walk over and stamp out the fire that had been bewitched by the witch. And he's experiencing some pain because he's, after all, barefoot. And it's the combination of that pain and his kind of good sense that leads to this statement that he makes. He says, suppose we have only dreamed or made up all those things. Trees and grass and sun and moon and stars and Aslan himself. Then all I can say is that, in that case, the made-up things seem a good deal more important than the real ones. Suppose this black pit of a kingdom of yours is the only world. Well, it strikes me as a pretty poor one. That actually is a very sound and profound philosophical statement that Publican makes. How would you know that the world that you find yourself in is wanting if you didn't have some sense that there was something better that was real that you could compare it to? But Publican being Publican, he's just despairing. He's saying, well, just settle for the dream rather than this awful place that you have here that we're all subject to. So anyway, this desire and this sense of correspondence, I think, is worth reflecting on. I want to reflect a little bit on the fact that, I think, I don't know if it was you, Josh, or you, Scott, that brought up the fact that sometimes people have a hard time reconciling themselves to the idea that fiction can tell the truth. Right? I don't know if you recall that statement. I come across that. In fact, I was just at a conference in Baltimore in which Joseph Pierce was speaking. Joseph Pierce is a really fascinating guy. I don't know if you're familiar with his name. But he's an Englishman. He now lives in the United States. He lives in one of the Carolinas. He never keep those two straight. But anyways, he's there. And he's published often in the Imaginative Conservative. So if you're familiar with that publication, maybe you can stumble over his work. But what makes him just so interesting is not just his writing, but his history, his own personal background. He was a part of the National Front in the United Kingdom, which means that he was a neo-Nazi. He was a neo-Nazi and a skinhead. And he had gone to jail for his involvement with that movement. So he was a leader of that movement. And while he was in prison, he had a lot of time in his hands, and there wasn't much reading material, but they did have Chesterton and Lewis and Tolkien in the library in the prison. And he was converted to reading Chesterton. I think it was Everlasting Man. Or it might have been, I think maybe it was Everlasting Man that he was reading. Or it might have been Orthodox. But anyway, you get the gist of it. And so today, he's known around the world because he's writing all the time on Chesterton and Lewis and Tolkien. And at this particular talk he gave in Baltimore last month, he said, I came across a bunch of seminarians. I was talking to him about the ability of stories to convey the truth. And I used Jesus and his parables as an example of this. And I pointed out, that the prodigal son is fiction. And apparently a couple of seminarians challenged him on that. Said, no, that really happened. The Lord was telling a story that he had witnessed. And, this perplexed Pierce and perplexes me. So the idea being, of course, that all of the parables are actually real events, things that actually happen. And the idea is that if we don't say that, then there's no sense in which we can say that they're true, because then they would just be completely made up. But this, I think, misses, the power of the theory of correspondence when it comes to truth. They're familiar with correspondence theory of truth. In other words, correspondence theory of truth maintains that for something to be true, there has to be a reality to which the statements that are being used to describe it correspond. So that's the correspondence theory of truth. If you say the sky is blue, there's actually a sky that can be blue or is blue on a nice day anyway. And you can say, well, that's how you know whether or not that statement is true or not. It's whether or not the sky is blue on a good day. Fiction. How can we maintain that fiction can tell the truth if we know that it is something that we've made up? Well, it's because what the story corresponds to is not history, but reality itself. When we think about the Transcendentalists, for example, truth, goodness, and beauty, it's the story in some sense connecting us to those realities that exist. If it does, we can say that it's true, even though the story itself, as it's woven, as the spell is woven, is made up of many things that are just the product of our human creativity and imaginations. And this, by the way, is something that Tolkien gets into a bit when he talks about primary and secondary creation. So the creation that we find ourselves in is made up of trees and rocks and blue skies and so forth, obviously has been made up by God. Something that existed in his mind and was spoken into being, and we get to enjoy. All of the creativity that we are able to bring about or make is the result of working with materials that he's already given us. So when we make up a character and a story, in some sense, it's the product of our ability to take and create based on the things that we've been given to create with. So even in that sense, it's not entirely false. There's a reality that exists outside of us that we're drawing on and we are working with to create characters and scenes and so forth. So we're not making up stuff out of nothing. But when it comes to this matter of telling the truth, moral truth, when we're talking about communicating goodness, when we're talking about beauty itself, we're in some sense, when we tell a story that is sound, engaged in a kind of correspondence activity in which we're, with our words, alluding to this reality that we didn't make. And so whether or not a story is true, when it comes to fiction, has to do with that. So a false story, a story in which things that are evil are celebrated as good, or falsehoods are presented to us as truths. Those things, that really is evil. That's not something that we can or should enjoy or celebrate. But when it comes to telling stories that awaken in us a longing for something that is real in the sense that we've not just described here, this reality that God has, that it owes its existence to God. Well, this is something that we ought to delight in. And when we hear those stories, they stir up within us the longings that we have described with words like disenchanted and so forth. This is a marvelous re-enchanting experience that we can be subject to. So I'm a preacher, and I love to be able to say that the children that I've had, who all, by the way, are believers and are having children of their own now, and it's marvelous to see. I enjoy my grandchildren. I wish I could say that I was the person who was responsible, for producing in them this longing for spiritual things, but I can't. In each of their cases, it was actually some book by somebody else that made a big difference. And in the case of my oldest son, it was the last battle. The very end, when, if you recall, characters find themselves in the real Narnia. And there's this statement, further up and further in. And they begin to do just that, go further up and further in. And as they do, things get better and better and better, the deeper, further, and higher they go. And it was that part of the story that my oldest son credits with his conversion. This awakening, this longing for something better in his life. So, this zephyr from heaven that he caught wind of, and this longing to go further and further in, something that I think those of us who wish to cast a strong spell or to awaken other people, it's something that we can long for and hopefully see happen through our writing and through our work. And isn't it interesting that the term is further up and further in and not farther up and farther in? Farther refers to actual physical characteristics in terms of transversing a certain space. In other words, it's referring to the physical world. Further up is metaphorical in character. And Lewis did this on purpose. Whenever you see this sort of thing in something that Lewis and Tolkien wrote, it wasn't just wasn't because they were using cliches. They thought about every single word and the significance of every word. If he meant farther in terms of transversing space, he would have used farther. But he used the word further, alluding to this kind of spiritual trek that we can even engage in now. And that's the thing I'd like for you to consider, that what can happen is when we have this dark enchantment addressed through a very strong spell that helps us to get a sense of not just a sense of longing, but a sense of hope that longing can be actually addressed and satisfied, that something marvelous can happen, that we carry over into our daily lives and in the world, the lives that we live in on a daily basis. Anyway, thank you very much. I hope that was helpful.